Welcome to the Audio Imaginarium. Come on in, weary traveler, hang your cloak on a peg, grab a stool, and come gather around the fire. There are stories to be told, and you are among friends. Author Steve Ubaney is standing by to present his best evidence that America's 32nd president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was murdered. That's right, murdered. So, if you're like me, you've always believed that FDR died of a sudden stroke or cerebral hemorrhage at the Little White House in Warm Springs, Georgia, back in April of 1945. If this is the case, Steve Ubaney wants to know, why were FDR's medical records stolen and destroyed? And are we really expected to believe that he died of natural causes at the same time Allied troops were closing in on Hitler's bunker? Are we really expected to believe that Roosevelt, Hitler, and Mussolini died within 18 days by mere coincidence? We are about to discover what Steve Ubaney found deep in the archives under more than 70 years of dust. Steve Ubaney is the holder of 4 college degrees and has been inducted into multiple national and international honor societies. He merged his love of history with his quest for the truth, and he became the architect of the Who Murdered book series. Since the inception of the series, numerous volumes have been published as he works toward the completion of a 6-volume set, which is scheduled for completion in 2022. Tonight we discuss Volume 2. Who Murdered FDR, the true story they don't want you to know. Steve Ubaney, welcome to the Conspiracy Show. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing very well, Richard. How are you?
Terrific. Why FDR? Why did you decide to dial back more than 70 years and write about FDR?
Well, you know what they say, to the victor go the spoils. Well, to the victor also go the lies. I never believed what I was told in high school about FDR and the end of the war. Pardon me. I thought it was a little bit too convenient. So I gave them the answer that they needed to get so I could pass the class and get my grade and this and that. But I always earmarked that moment in time in history as never making sense to me. So that's what started my interest in this subject.
FDR is he's a very divisive character in history because people either absolutely adored him for, they believe, lifting them out of poverty during the Depression, or they absolutely hated this man because they thought he was an authoritarian, a dictator, and a communist. Where do you fall in terms of your regard for the 32nd president?
Well, you know, I love him and hate him. I think that he helped a lot of people in a time when people really needed help. He was an excellent communicator, and of course the communication channel of the day was radio, so he was a very warm person in everyone's living room, giving them messages of hope and encouragement that things would get better. And of course, he subscribed to the Marxist theory that academia and government could cure all of the ills of mankind. And, you know, of course, now we know that it takes more, takes a little bit more than that to cure all the ills of mankind. But he helped a lot of people. He was a good guy. His the economy, the New Deal that he put in place was basically a communist Marxist doctrine, or a takeoff thereof, putting everyone to work for the taxpayer. And it had never been done before. I mean, this was landmark. This was huge. And because it had never been done before, they really didn't know how it was going to work. So I think he was a great communicator. I think he was a very beloved person. I think history shows that, you know, his economic strategy was a nightmare. But I also think he was probably the best war president we've ever had.
Now, before you sort of paint the picture of him as essentially a communist, or certainly very sympathetic to communists, you spend some time depicting his struggles, obviously, with polio, and really he is a very sympathetic and likable figure, although early on, sort of born with certainly a silver spoon in his mouth, had zero relatability to the average man in the street because of his upbringing and his wealth. Let's just spend a little bit of time talking about Franklin as a young man. growing up in a very sheltered, privileged life, obviously, in New York.
Well, Franklin Roosevelt, if you ever get a chance to go to Hyde Park and visit the Roosevelt Mansion, which houses the National Archives, which I spent an enormous amount of time doing the research for this book, if you ever have a chance to do that, and do the tour of the museum, do it, you'll get a very good idea of what this person was like, and what it must have been like being a child on those lush grounds in the Hudson Valley. He was an only child. Anything that he possibly could have wanted, he could have gotten, just for the asking. Roosevelts are old money. And when I say old money, I mean that they were worth multiple millions of dollars at a time in America when people didn't have anything. I mean, they were probably more wealthy than anyone who was ever wealthy in the country at the time. Second, probably only to the Vanderbilts, who was just down the road a quarter of a mile from their mansion. They had the Vanderbilt mansion. So we're dealing with some heavy hitters back in the day. Had very little to do with the common man. Why? Because he had no exposure to the common man. He was a very wealthy, very sheltered, very spoiled little guy who, basically got everything that he wanted. That all changed when he ended up contracting polio, and basically all he could do was blink. I mean, he had no use of his arms or his legs, and the very idea that he had the second lease on life is incredible. Just when you think you read something about Franklin Roosevelt that you're not going to like, you read about how he persevered and won back the use of his arms and fought his way back from a disease that was kind of tough. This was a very determined person. So, he brings himself back, starts with the use of his arms, and he has bars installed over his bed so he can do chin-ups and work on the strength of his arms, and has parallel bars installed in the front yard of his house so he could continue to exercise his arms and work their way back from this infantile paralysis or polio. And he tries to do the same thing with his legs. And he walked a couple of miles every day. And what he called walking was using braces with his arms and dragging his legs behind him with 12-pound steel braces on each leg. And he walked to Route 5 and back every day, sometimes multiple times a day, trying to get those legs to work. And, of course, he was unsuccessful. That was the earmark and the change in his life when he went from being a spoiled brat to starting to seek cures for his legs and meet other people in need. So this was a transformation point in this person's life.
And his path to the White House, we're coming up on a break. We'll begin that conversation now and pick it up on the other side. For many presidents, the path to the White House has been governor of New York. His cousin, Teddy Roosevelt, governor of New York. Other presidents have gone that route. But at that time, New York was Republican. His cousin was a Republican. How did he become governor of New York? Obviously name recognition had a huge amount to do with it, but to battle the Republican machine in New York, and his cousin must not have been too pleased either.
It wasn't easy for him, and it was just, again, it's just due to that enormous will and ego and the determination this person had to use that last name successfully. In order to garner power with the other side of the family, he married his cousin. Eleanor Roosevelt was born a Roosevelt, married a Roosevelt, died a Roosevelt. He married his cousin, Eleanor Roosevelt. And even the tour guide at the Franklin Roosevelt Museum thought that it was to garner favor with the Republican side of the family because he was eyeing the governor run. So very interesting stuff with Franklin Roosevelt. And we're just this is just the tip of the iceberg.
All right, Steve, hold on. We'll take a time out, come back, and continue to delve into who murdered FDR. The true story they don't want you to know. Steve Ubaney, my guest, right here on The Conspiracy Show. My name is Richard Syrett. Stay with us.
When in doubt, blame the government. You're listening to The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett.
Steve Ubaney, my guest. Who murdered FDR? The true story they don't want you to know. And Steve is with us for the full 2 hours. We will open up the phone lines in hour 2. So don't call in just yet. Just sit, listen, enjoy, and likely learn a thing or two about the remarkable life of the 32nd President of the United States. And, of course, where this is all heading is April 12, 1945, when, well, most of us firmly believed and were taught that he died of a cerebral hemorrhage at the age of 63. Why not? He was sickly. But we'll get around to that. Right now, what else was interesting was, and you document this in the book, how the illusion was created that he was a fit, virile man, while his legs were in an incredibly atrophied condition. Part of this were these sturdy steel braces that he wore on his legs so that he could stand erect for hours. But also the media played a big part in helping prop him up, literally and figuratively. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, he had struck a deal with the media that he was not to be shown getting in or out of an automobile. And there's even video footage that exists right now of the Secret Service telling the people, okay, shut your cameras off. They were cooperating with this person to cloak the fact that he was, quote unquote, walking, clutching one person's arm on one side with 12-pound weights on each foot and walking with a cane. He was really doing no such thing, but he had practiced it to the point where he gave the illusion that he was walking. And he had to do this for a couple of reasons. Back then they thought, incorrectly, by the way, they thought that if people had some sort of a physical ailment or physical disability, that they couldn't possibly be mentally stable. So he thought that had to be ruled in order for him to further his political career. So that's basically how that happened. It actually went to the point where he paid an insurance company, and this is covered in my book as well. He paid an insurance company to insure his health and attest to the fact that how healthy he was and this and that. It was at a $500,000 policy that they issued on his health. And of course, it was nothing more than a political stunt picked up by the local newspapers to get him to further his career, because at that point in time, his career was over.
You also point out here that in the 20s, news photographers actually voluntarily destroyed their own plates if they showed Roosevelt in poses that revealed his handicap. They didn't have to be told to do that. They did it voluntarily.
I think that back then it was a lot different than today. That's for sure. I think that back then there was a little more dignity to the press, and they really didn't have any vested interest in cutting the knees out from someone, so to speak. I think that it was just an unwritten rule that they didn't take advantage of someone's disability, or they didn't put anyone in a bad light. So I think that I know that in some cases they were paid. In other areas they did it voluntarily.
So when he came to power in the election of 1932 and was sworn in 1933. Let's just talk about what was happening at that time in the United States. The decades prior even, communists had infiltrated the government, most of the labor unions, influencing most of America's social reformers. So this is sort of the backdrop of when Roosevelt comes to power. Communists had already infiltrated virtually all aspects of the American government, correct?
That's absolutely correct. And, we have to say this, and I know a lot of people are going to have their jaws open because, we're throwing this word communism about, the communism back then, they didn't know anything about evil empires or anything bad or any connotation that was terrible with communism. It was proposed as the next big thing. It was going to stop the pitfalls of capitalism, and it was a cradle-to-grave society where everyone would be cared for. That's all they knew. Okay, and how this happened was at the end of the war. Calvin Coolidge had a great economy going, and of course, his term ended, and Herbert Hoover started fiddling with the knobs and levers of everything. Ended the roaring 20s, and here we are in a capitalist bust. So Stalin, in all of his wisdom, and he was awfully sharp, extended invitations to news media, those in academia, those in arts and entertainment, some people in Hollywood, to come to the Soviet Union and view this new great system of government that they had found. And they came over and they were taken to by Stalin's police. They were given guided tours to what they call Potemkin villages. Potemkin villages basically are facades, phony villages that didn't function. And they were shown how this cradle-to-grave society where high taxes and everyone was cared for, and how everyone was fed, how pristine the cities were, and everything worked. And they were sent back to the States with packets of propaganda as to how they could transform America from the capitalist issue that was going on to the new communist ideology where everyone was going to be cared for. So out of this, in 1919, started the Communist Party, the CPUSA, the Communist Party in the United States of America, which is still in existence, actually, in New York City. And if you go to their website, the platform, the political platform, greatly mirrors that of the Democrats in today's world. Back then, it was sponsored by Stalin through his operatives and people who visited Russia to overthrow the government. So, very interesting how it had its start. This started basically with the elite, self-proclaimed academia, other academia that were legitimate, and of course, Franklin Roosevelt was in the vanguard of these people. So he comes to Washington with these ideas, and he starts the New Deal, which is basically a cradle-to-grave society, where if you ate, if you slept, if you used a utility, it's because the government allowed it. So this was the backbone of the Communist Party in that era.
And it's amazing how history mirrors, today we have, these accusations of Russian collusion with Trump, and yet back then, 70 years ago, it was real. It was going. There literally was a communist hiding under every bed. Senator McCarthy was, he was certainly a bull in a china shop and a nasty man. Perhaps the problem was he didn't realize how right he was.
Well, this is exactly right, and it's interesting how history plays games with you. Okay, here we have 75 years later, we have another New Yorker, another president, another polarizing figure, love him or hate him, anything like FDR, love him or hate him, because people did both. One was a liberal, this one is a Republican, or I don't know if you can call him a conservative, but go ahead. The only difference, one was actually, there were so many communists and Russians around Roosevelt, it was absolutely incredible. The laundry list, they had infiltrated every part of government. Today's world, just the hint of the Russians being involved in government or an election is creating 2 years now of investigation. So it's interesting. History is kind of repeating itself, but, kind of not. It's a little bit different, but it can tend to be a little more of the same. It's amazing how, the White House communists around Roosevelt had infiltrated, there were 15 high-ranking officials, starting from Harry Dexter White to Ward Pigman to Elger Hist, and they were in every single part of our government, from the Agricultural Adjustment Administration to the Attorney General's office, the Department of State, the National Labor Relations Board, the Labor Advisory Board, the War Production Board, the Price Administration, the U.S. Treasury Department. The U.S. Treasury Department had been infiltrated by communists. Hard to believe. And finally, the Public Welfare Committee. So we were just being, if they had fur hats on, they would have been awfully easy to spot. Unfortunately, back in those days, they thought communism was a great thing. Even Eleanor Roosevelt. When I went to the Roosevelt Museum, she has a 3-drawer filing cabinet. She was under investigation for being a communist, and it's right in the middle of the museum. And if you go to my book, there are files that I show in my book of FDR and communism and how friendly he was with this ideology. So in my book, when I say that FDR was a communist, It's not that way because I say it's that way. It's that way because that's the way the research does it.
Right, right. There was also a mutual admiration society going on between Roosevelt and Mussolini. People don't maybe realize that Mussolini was a communist and wrote for a communist magazine and a newspaper, and was very enamored of Roosevelt's progressive policies. And likewise, Roosevelt sent a delegation to Italy. This was obviously before the outbreak of the war, to study Mussolini's policies because they were so progressive, quote, end quote. So you have that going on. But how did Roosevelt, how did he garner such broad executive power? How did that happen?
Well, you're dealing with a man who was very mentally dynamic. He could get just about anything in government that he wanted because, number one, he had a great persuasive way with the people, and he could do something, and he could convince the people that what he was doing was in their best interest, if it was or not. Most times, he probably felt that it was. There were a few times where he obviously knew that it wasn't. So he could sell that, whatever he wanted to do, very well, which gained him, incredible power in government. And hey, let's face it, people tend to like free things, and you vote the guy back in who's giving you free things. So this is kind of the way this happened. Long about the time the New Deal had started to play itself out, the economy was coming back, not at all like they had thought. So he had proposed a second New Deal, and it didn't go over very well. And they had determined, the court at the time, the Supreme Court had determined that significant portions of the second New Deal were unconstitutional. So FDR, in his power, tried to change the balance of the court to get this through and add more judges to the court to get his second New Deal through, also known as packing the court. So he was a guy who was extremely sharp, very shrewd, steps ahead of people, and could sell it to the public.
And yet, when the United States wasn't at war, the Congress drew up this Trading with the Enemy Act, and to give him the power that he needed. How does that happen? How do you have a Trading with the Enemy Act at a time of peace?
I'm sorry, Richard, you broke up a little bit. Can you repeat that?
Well, I was just curious that to grant him these powers, Congress enacted this Trading with the Enemy Act, and this was at a time when the United States was at peace.
He could get just about anything that he wanted. Trading with the Enemy Act, or TIWA, started under Woodrow Wilson in 1917, along with the Sedition Act. TIWA was basically a Trading with the Enemy Act, and there were certain times where, for example, in 1933, he did the Emergency Banking Relief Act, and he would go after people who were hoarding gold. So he started an executive order to gather the gold back. In order to do that, he had to make it possible for the American public to be enemies, legally to make that work. It's really interesting how this happened. And the Sedition Act of 1918 started under Woodrow Wilson. Anything that, any speech or any abusive language or anything against the government was, would be an offense. And, you could go to jail for it. Very interesting how we've evolved as a country. Whereas now, they can just do just about anything they want, vulgar or not, and shove it in your face, and there's nothing anybody's doing about it.
When you look at the list, the laundry list of New Deal legislation, Emergency Banking Act, Government Economy Act, Beer Wine Revenue Act, creation of Civilian Conservation Corps, abandonment of gold standard, Federal Emergency Relief Act, Tennessee Valley Authority Act, Securities Act, abrogation of gold payment clause, etc., etc., etc. You make the point here that essentially he gave himself the kind of power that Joseph Stalin would probably have been envious of.
Well, the mutual admiration society between FDR and Joseph Stalin is one that no one can overemphasize. He just loved everything about Joseph Stalin. He called him Uncle Joe. And when World War II came around, They were very, very leery of Joseph Stalin because they knew he was a monster, but they started to realize the enemy of my enemy has to be my friend. So he admired Joseph Stalin, he admired his policies, he admired his rule. He was a little leery of him because he didn't understand him. And he was right to be leery about him because Stalin is the one that murdered him.
Well, we don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves here, but at this time, he's also making a lot of enemies at home, particularly with a lot of these New Deal era tax increases. Just talk to me a little bit about the sorts of individuals, companies that were perhaps most hurt by Roosevelt's New Deal and who these new enemies were.
Well, again, I don't believe that because the New Deal legislation and the taxes that accompanied it had never happened before. He had no idea that when he was giving to the poor, he was crushing the rich. And the poor has to work somewhere. So, when you're crushing the companies to employ the people, you tend to self-perpetuate yourself in the New Deal. But to answer your question, some of the people who just absolutely hated him because he was just crushing their companies were DuPont Chemical, Eastman Kodak, Harvey Firestone, Samuel Colgate, the toothpaste company, Henry Ford, Carnegie Steel, the Heinz family, the Mellon family, who was in the banking arena. He just the Coca-Cola company. I mean, he was just crushing these companies with this legislation. It was just red tape after red tape after red tape to the point where no one could hire anyone. So not only and I don't believe he did this on purpose, and scholars have argued about this. They fought over this. Was he doing this to perpetuate his presidency because there were no term limits at the time? Did he know ahead of time that he was going to be elected and reelected and reelected because he was getting people addicted to his handouts? Personally, I don't believe that. I think this had never been done before, and the fact that he was crushing these companies was just, ignorance of what was going on with the economy.
Stephen, I got to jump in here. We'll take a timeout, come back. We'll talk about FDR and the United States enters the war. Back with more of my conversation with Steve Ubaney, author of Who Murdered FDR. Stay with us.
There is nothing concealed that won't be revealed. The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett.
Welcome back. Steve Ubaney is with us. Who Murdered FDR? The true story they don't want you to know. Roosevelt had campaigned and won, based on his promise to keep the United States out of the war. But that changed, obviously, in December of 1941. What changed? I mean, we know about Pearl Harbor, but there was something that happened before that drilled home the point to Roosevelt. He knew he had to get the United States into that war and fast. Explain what happened.
Well, a couple of things happened. As I said, pardon me, he started to realize that the New Deals were not going to work on their own, and he knew that we needed the influx of industry to pull us out of the war. That was the first thing.
Out of the Depression, you mean? Out of the Depression.
I'm sorry. Yeah,
right.
Did I misspeak? Sorry.
That's all right.
Yeah. So the second thing that happened was Roosevelt had to have that war happen for economic purposes. And he also had to have the war happen because we had spies in Germany who were we all have spies, guys. I mean, let's be real. I mean, we have spies. Every country is spying on every country. So the United States has spies too. I'm sorry to break anybody's normalcy bias, but we do, okay? So back then, our spies were in Germany and they were in tight. And they were starting to trickle information back to Washington that the Nazis were very close to finishing their heavy water experiments. And that's the beginning of nuclear weaponry. And with their V-2 rockets and Werner von Braun, they had the technology to carry those nuclear weapons to all points of the globe. We needed to get in the war, and we needed to get in this war fast. So he had to sell this to the American people because prior to this point, he'd been saying that this was Europe's war. This was Europe's war. We're not doing anything with it. It's their war. So
aside from granting huge loans to Great Britain.
Oh yes, we were doing Lend-Lease with Great Britain, and we're doing all kinds of things to try and prop up Great Britain, who was on the brink of losing their island. In my book, I have a 97-year-old aunt who was actually in the bombings, 52 nights of being bombed by Hitler, and she says, right, it's an interesting interview in my book with her. She said, you have absolutely no idea how close they came to losing their island. They thought, they being the Germans, that they were just going to bomb them night after night after night, and they were just going to give up, just like, what had happened in France, because he basically rolled over France. And he said that the Germans were lined up on the opposite side of the English Channel, just waiting to come over and take the island over. And they came really close to losing the island. So if it wasn't for us helping Churchill and the Brits, they would have lost their island. So we needed to get into the war, and we had broken the Japanese codes for long before Pearl Harbor happened. So documents have now been revealed through History.com. FDR definitely knew that Pearl Harbor was going to be hit. So he was also trying to goad the Japanese into war. Japan is an oil debtor nation, which means that they don't create or make enough oil or produce enough oil to support their endeavors. So they were getting their oil from us in the 1940s. So Roosevelt turned off their spigot. There's no more oil for them. That forced them to go island hopping to get more oil. So they were trying to negotiate with us. The Japanese didn't want to go to war with us. They had just exited a horrific war with China. The last thing they wanted was to go to war with the United States. So they were trying to negotiate. FDR was ignoring them. Political change happened. They became a warring empire, and they decided to go island hopping. So FDR basically made that war happen. He needed to make that war happen because he needed to get us into World War II quickly. So you make the argument that Roosevelt knew about the attack on Pearl Harbor before it happened. That was necessary in order to sacrifice thousands of U.S. servicemen and civilians in order to galvanize public support for the United States getting into the war. That's absolutely right. And the History.com has come up with documents that I didn't find, which I'm embarrassed I didn't find. But they found top secret documents and published them here just a little bit after my book was published to solidify that very fact. We needed to get into the war. We needed to get into it fast. So shortly before they hit Pearl Harbor, the aircraft carriers were pulled out so they would not be harmed because they were going to be important to the rest of the war.
Right. At that point, the aircraft carriers were crucial to winning the war. Battleships, not so much.
And, he needed to, yes, absolutely. And, he needed to sell the war to the American public, and it took something horrific like Pearl Harbor in which to do so.
It is curious that there were no aircraft carriers in Pearl Harbor at the time. I guess Admiral King had ordered them out just in time. So that does sound very suspicious. So, what a decision that... And you don't fault him for this. Having to make that decision, it would have been like Lincoln during the Civil War. No other president would have had to have gone through something like that. He had to accept the fate that thousands of servicemen would be killed in order to prevent perhaps the wholesale slaughter of tens of millions because the Germans were so close to getting the bomb. All right, we'll take it. Sorry.
I'm sure that he must have agonized over it because Franklin Roosevelt was not a bad man. You have to, when you're in that leadership role, and hey, how do we know what any other president's done in history? We really don't. This just happens to be what we found. I'm sure there's other examples that are even far worse in history. But, Franklin Roosevelt had to realize that we needed to take this punch in the eye. And I'm sure he agonized over it. I'm sure it was an awful decision for him, but unfortunately, leaders have to make those decisions, from time to time.
All right, Stephen, stay put. We'll come back and continue to discuss who murdered FDR right here on The Conspiracy Show. My name is Richard Syrett. Don't go away.
The world is being pulled over your eyes. This is The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett.
Steve Ubaney is with us for the full 2 hours, and we will take calls, questions, comments after the top of the hour. Who Murdered FDR? This is Volume 2 in his Who Murdered book series. Who Murdered FDR, the true story they don't want you to know. So, the United States enters the war. How did Roosevelt and Churchill get on, knowing that, or was Churchill aware that Roosevelt was an admirer of Stalin? Did that cause any friction?
Roosevelt and Churchill had a great working relationship. The two liked each other. They worked well together. They trusted each other. Churchill hated Stalin. Had to meet with him. Couldn't stand him. And I think that it may have bothered Churchill how friendly FDR was with his ideology, because, to my knowledge, Churchill didn't describe to them. But I don't think it was any sort of lasting animosity or any animosity. I think it was, the enemy of my enemy needs to be my friend. And I think that they were able at that moment in time to save humanity, put it behind them.
And did Roosevelt and Churchill, did they butt heads on how to handle Stalin? Did they talk about, looking forward to these summits that they had in Tehran and so forth?
Well, they both knew that he was a temporary ally, and they were a little leery about him because we know now about the Great Purge, we know now about all of these things, but I don't think that they may have known, but I don't surely they didn't know that Stalin had murdered 1 million people on a whim in his own country for something to do with show trials. I think that they were leery of some of the rumors they had heard, but I don't think that they knew that. I don't think that really came out into, again, to the victor go the spoils. I don't think that actually came out until after the war. So they were worried about getting in bed with him for the war, but they were more worried about. They knew that Stalin had his eye on the post-war world, and that's what concerned them. So they had to handle him with kid gloves.
In the meantime, Hitler is sending over assassination teams to the United States. I wasn't aware of this until I read your book. How many assassins were trying to track Roosevelt down? Talk to me about these spy rings that were out for FDR.
Richard, I'm sorry, you're breaking up. Can you repeat that?
I didn't know about all of these assassination teams that Hitler had unleashed in the United States to go after FDR. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Well, the Duquesne spy ring had 33 members. It was the largest spy network in American history. And their overall mission, was to assassinate high-level operatives and high-level government officials and to sabotage our government. So that was started by Hitler. And then, of course, Operation Pistorius also was started by Hitler. It had 8 members, and it was created after Pearl Harbor. And it attacked Sicilian targets and heads of state. And all of them, I believe, got the electric chair. I mean, unfortunate enough that they were able to thwart their efforts. But I mean, these people, these two sides were trying to assassinate and poison each other back and forth throughout the war. Hitler had at least 42 attempts on his life from 1933 to 1944. And including, there was even one of his high-ranking generals, the Desert Fox, Erwin Rommel, was caught trying to start a coup from inside Germany to overthrow the Fuhrer, and he was forced to take cyanide on July 20th, 1944. So I mean, this is They had squads out to hit each other. As a matter of fact, in my book, there's a right out of Maxwell Smart. There's a photo of a top secret document from the Royal Air Force, I believe. They had tried to murder Winston Churchill with an exploding chocolate bar. The Nazi bomb makers had figured out how to get a chocolate bar, a bomb to look like a chocolate bar, to get it in on the tray into the war room and get it in front of Churchill so when he unwrapped it, it would blow his head off. So these guys had been going back and forth, trying to knock the other one off, the opposition leaders off, by any means necessary. A couple times, Operation Long Jump happened, where they were trying to, I believe in Tehran Conference, where Hitler had a squad that was supposed to assassinate all three of them. And of course, just in the nick of time, they were caught because it almost worked. Hitler almost got all three of them at the Tehran Conference.
Was it during the Tehran Conference that in 1943, I believe, that we first it was first noticed that Roosevelt started to look gaunt and sickly as early as 43?
It was, and Tehran was in November of 1943, and that's when, he's still a healthy man, and again, the pictures are all in my book. What he looked like at Tehran in 1943 and what he looked like at Yalta in 1945 was drastically different. In 1943, at the Tehran Conference, he started to have very strange health swings, problems with his health. They were served steak and potato dinner, and he got so violently ill, he turned green and started to sweat and started to vomit. They actually had to, one of his right-hand man, Harry Hopkins, who went everywhere with him, had to actually remove him from the room. It became so bad. It was then that crazy things started to happen. On the way back from the Tehran Conference, one of FDR's top generals, Major General Paul Watson, died of a cerebral hemorrhage, and they figured that he was poisoned. FDR's personal secretary, McIntyre, no relation to Dr. McIntyre, he also died of a cerebral hemorrhage. So what we have now is we have people within the White House starting to play games and assassinate people with a poisoning that is creating cerebral hemorrhage.
And around this time, his mental health also on the wane. His mental capacity is waning. Couldn't have happened at a worse time, obviously, because as 1944 moves into 1945, the Allied leaders, Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt, are basically divvying up the spoils and looking at what the post-war world will look like. So what a horrible time for Roosevelt to essentially be in a fog.
Well, it was planned out perfectly. I mean, if Roosevelt just suddenly showed up dead, it would look a little suspicious. So he was being slowly poisoned from within the White House by a poison that they didn't know. They knew in Europe and the other countries, but we were behind a little bit. There was a poisoning that was a common item that we had no idea was going to poison someone like this. And this is what started his demise. Because if you look at, I had always thought all through school, I had been told that it was just the advance of his polio and so forth, and that's what happened to him and so forth. It's completely untrue. The advance of polio does not, the symptoms of the advance of polio does not align with Dr. Leahy's assessment of the man on July 10th of 1944. Roosevelt's doctors, Dr. McIntyre, Dr. Bruin, Dr. Paulin, became so baffled why he was getting so sick at meal times, and his body wasn't responding to any medication. His blood pressure was spiraling out of control, and it would come back to normal, and then it would go to 310/195, and it would come back to normal. So they took this ailing person to Dr. Frank Leahy, who was the doctor of the day. He was the founder of the Leahy Clinic in Boston. And they basically said, what's wrong with this guy? We don't have a clue. Here's all of our information. We need help. So Frank Leahy looked at this man and determined, and of course, History.com in 2011 released Dr. Leahy's findings. And you can see him if you want to go online and look at him. This is what I started, when I saw this, I started to realize that there was more going on here. My suspicions were right all along about how Roosevelt actually died. Roosevelt's actual symptoms, well, I won't bother you with a laundry list, but I'll give you a synopsis here. He was having cardiovascular disease. He was having intellectual and mental problems. He was having sensory motor problems, gastrointestinal problems, and his nervous system was a wreck. He had skeletal problems. He was turning colors. His kidneys were failing. None of that is the advance of polio. It's the advance of poisoning. Every time FDR left the White House and went to Warm Springs, Georgia, or another location, he started to feel better. He goes back to the White House, bam, these symptoms happen again. So every now and then in your research, and boy, did I do research, you get lucky. And I found Margaret Suckley, Daisy Suckley, was one of FDR's cousins, one of his favorite cousins, and she had published a diary entitled Closest Companion. And her quote here on page 203 is pretty telling. She said that it's a president's fourth day in bed and he still feels somewhat miserable. This is a quote. Although his fever is gone, last Tuesday without any warning he fell ill at noon, also known as lunchtime when people eat. He lay in the study in the sofa until 4:30 p.m. when he found he had a temperature of 102. Get this. Dr. McIntyre found it was a toxic poisoning, but they couldn't describe anything to it. Right there, they know he's being poisoned from within the White House. And what they were doing was they were treating him with sulfa drugs. But they still couldn't detect the poisoning. So FDR was being slowly poisoned from within the White House, from communist plants. So when it came time to divvy up the world, he would be out of the way and no one would be none the wiser. So as a matter of fact, when he dies at Warm Springs, Georgia on April 12, 1945, he dies in the presence of 2 Russian spies. Very interesting book.
Right. We will get to that after the top of the hour, when we'll open up the phone lines and take questions and comments for Stephen Ubaney, researcher, author, Who Murdered FDR? The True Story They Don't Want You to Know. Back with more in a moment.
Live from Toronto, Canada, The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett.
Thanks for inviting me into your home. Long-haul truck, RV, camper, taxi. Your parents' well-appointed rec room with the wood paneling and the air hockey table. Your loft, that greasy spoon just off the interstate, and your cabin in the woods. Hi to all of you catching The Conspiracy Show on one of our affiliate stations across North America. Those, of course, who listen and watch on The Conspiracy Show YouTube channel. If you haven't already done so, please check it out and hit that red subscription button. And the Conspiracy Show app, of course. Those listening on the Conspiracy Show app, wherever and however you're listening, I bid thee the warmest of welcomes, and I thank you for your fine company. Steve Ubaney is standing by, the author, Who Murdered FDR? The True Story They Don't Want You to Know. This is Volume 2 in his Who Murdered book series. Just a reminder, no live YouTube stream tonight. And if you can't wait a whole week before the next Conspiracy Show, you need to check out my podcast, Conspiracy Unlimited. New episodes drop every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Listen and subscribe at conspiracyunlimitedpodcast.com. Conspiracyunlimitedpodcast.com. And while you're at it, check out the website, strangeplanet.ca. Strangeplanet.ca. We've given it an overhaul, a fresh coat of paint, and it's far easier to navigate, and far more mobile friendly as well. All right. Before the break, we were talking with Steve Ubaney about FDR and how he was slowly being poisoned from within the White House. Now, I want to talk about certain individuals surrounding FDR. And I want to talk about his mistresses. He had a number of them, including a Lucy Mercer, who Eleanor Roosevelt found out about. And she basically gave the president an ultimatum. What was that ultimatum?
Well, Lucy Mercer was the social secretary to Eleanor Roosevelt, and she had a 30-year affair with FDR. And actually, one of FDR's daughters had arranged meetings for Lucy and FDR. So here's cousin Eleanor, also his wife, who finds love letters back and forth and tells FDR, hey, look, if you want a divorce, I'll give you a divorce. You can be with her. So, FDR basically says, I'm not going to disgrace my family name and my political career with a divorce, and I'm not going to have this scandal happen on my watch. So that was the pivotal point in their marriage. They basically became a marriage of convenience. They went their separate ways. So when he dies, April 12, 1945, in Warm Springs, Georgia, she's nowhere to be found. Who is to be found is Lucy Mercer, who he swore that he wouldn't carry on an affair with, but did anyway. One of those things. So it's an interesting little plot that weaves through the FDR White House.
Right.
Now, there's been many things said about FDR's death. One person, actually 2 doctors, wrote a book claiming that he had died of cancer and said that there was a wart over his eye that was causing problems that had grown into his brain and so forth. And I always say that, I've seen people die from cancer. Unfortunately, I've never seen them go from bad to worse and bad to worse and good again and bad to worse. Usually they just drift off and die. I've never seen anybody with cancer end up bipolaring back and forth from a vibrant health to death's door and all of these crazy things. So I think you'll find my book to be a little bit different, and I try and back it up as much as possible because it is a hot button topic.
Sure. I want to talk about another woman that was at Warm Springs, at the Little White House in Warm Springs on April 12th, 1945. Who was Elizabeth Sumath?
Oh, boy. Elizabeth Sumath is a very interesting woman, and I got a lot of information on her from the book that she published. She was, if you've never seen her paintings or her artwork, you have to Google it. This is probably one of the most incredible painters I've ever seen. And she was a defected Russian. Her and her husband, Leo, came to this country and lived in multiple locations around Long Island and that era of New York State. And she was an Ivanov. Her parents were high-ranking in the Russian government. She defected again, like I said, with her husband, Leo, who was, quote-unquote, on a mission, according to her book, but she never quite says what this mission is. So he goes on to work for the Sikorsky Aviation Company as a business manager with no business experience. Sikorsky, also a Russian. She ends up being a painter who travels the country painting for all of the people that can't stand Roosevelt, all of the garden club from the DuPonts to the Hiltons, and painting their portraits and so forth. So she was at Warm Springs, Georgia, with her photographer, Nicholas Kubakinski, in front of the president when he dies. So, Nicholas Kubakinski, I know I have to get boring, I'm sorry, bear with me. There's a good ending here, I promise. Nicholas Kubakinski, that was the name, he was also a defected Russian. That was his naturalization papers were Kubakinski. It was changed to Cobbins, and it was later changed to Nicholas Robbins. He was her photographer, snapping stills of the president so she could work late at night and not keep the president tied up with her time. So these are 2 Russian plants painting FDR in a room alone with him when the man dies.
So is it possible then that Nicholas Robbins, as he was then known, or the portrait painter Elizabeth Sumath were the ones administering the poison?
It's entirely possible. I'm not going to give the ending of the book away, but yeah, you're not far off. There's no way, and we have to back up a second. we have to put ourselves cast in this time period of the Waltons, okay? There's no way that Secret Service is going to verify Nicholas Robbins, who's on his third alias. They were just trusted friends from Lucy Mercer and Missy Lehan to come paint this president. There's no way they were being verified or checked out by Secret Service. It would have been impossible. So we were a little more naive at the time, not like today. Today wouldn't matter who you are if you're on the president, you got to get checked out. So it was it was very possible that, very probable actually, that he was being dosed with something to murder him by those two people.
And as you point out, Elizabeth Sumath was also painting portraits of, a who's who of America's elite, many of whom had absolute disdain for Roosevelt and his policies, which were costing them a fortune.
Oh, he was costing the money people in the Garden Club of America millions and millions of dollars. Any one of and she was within their company within the 12 months prior to Roosevelt's death. And again, I'll go down the list: the DuPonts, Eastman Kodak, Harvey Firestone, Henry Ford, Carnegie Steel, the Heinz family, the Hilton family, the Mellon family, Robert Woodruff of Coca-Cola. Any one of these people would have slipped her money to poison the president, just because it was in their best interest. He was absolutely crippling their businesses.
And now they had someone who had open and free access to the president.
Exactly. So in my book, in all of my books, I lay out motive, means, and opportunity. I cite each of the suspects, figure out who they'll be, and I screen them through motive, means, and opportunity in this investigation to come out with the person who murdered the subject matter, the subject. And in this case, it happens to be FDR. So, as the end of the war is coming, Stalin is buddies with FDR, or so FDR thinks. FDR is proposing the four policemen to the world. China, the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union. Stalin has to be one of the biggest megalomaniacs in history. He doesn't want to share the world with FDR. He wants to rule the world. He's not going to play the game with FDR. So, we have to dig into Stalin, and my book does a really good job of doing that, to understand how this happened. Stalin murdered both of his wives because they knew too much. Stalin murdered his own doctor because he knew too much. He murdered about 1.5 million of his own countrymen for something to do. He was probably, if you look up megalomaniac in the dictionary, there should be a picture of Joseph Stalin there. This guy was an absolute murdering mental case. So he being Stalin, he wanted FDR out of the way at the end of the war. He wanted to deal with Harry Truman. Apparently he didn't know Harry Truman very well, but he knew that he was a political newcomer. He wasn't going to be as shrewd. FDR was a shrewd customer, and he was a good negotiator. And
boy, did he read Truman wrong. Did he underestimate Truman? Listen, Stephen, we'll take a time out. When we come back, I want to talk to you about another central figure in this plot, Harry Hopkins, one of FDR's closest advisors. Could he be a suspect? Back with more of The Conspiracy Show, along with Steve Ubaney, who murdered FDR. Stay with us. Welcome back. Steve Ubaney is with us. Who Murdered FDR? This is Volume 2 in his Who Murdered book series. Who Murdered FDR? The true story they don't want you to know. And as Steve has laid out the case, Roosevelt was slowly poisoned. Harry Hopkins, one of his closest advisors. Let's talk about him. How close was Hopkins to Stalin?
Well, before we get to that, Richard, I just want to tell everybody, if you want to order this book, don't go to Amazon and order this book. Go to my website, order a book, go to whomurderedbooks.com, buy it there. It's much cheaper, and I'll be able to get you a copy out. And, we're coming into the holiday season here. I don't know where in the world you can get somebody off your Christmas list for $16. So it might be good to pick up a couple copies. They're also available on ebook and audiobook everywhere. But go to whomurderedbooks.com. I'm currently butting heads with Amazon, so I just wanted to get that out there. As far as Harry Hopkins is concerned, Harry Hopkins is probably one of the most important people in the World War II era that no one knows about. Harry Hopkins was, because FDR couldn't travel because of the wheelchair and the leg braces, he needed someone to go overseas with him and go meet with Stalin and other dignitaries in other countries and be his representative. And Harry Hopkins was that person. Harry Hopkins came to know FDR through the Communist Party of the United States of America, the CPUSA. And they were housed in the middle of New York City on 253rd West 23rd Street, actually, in New York City. He was friends with Henrietta Nesbitt, who was the White House cook, and Eleanor Roosevelt. So they met through this connection, and he ended up being very involved with just about everything in the New Deal. As a matter of fact, he was one of the architects of the New Deal. So he was lived at the White House. FDR wouldn't let him leave. He was quite influential to FDR, and he was definitely running around the world on FDR's behalf. So he was a very interesting and pivotal figure in history that no one seems to know about.
He was so powerful, you describe him as a co-president.
Absolutely. And it seemed like Harry Hopkins was to FDR what Edwin House was to Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson, of course, was FDR's mentor, coming through the ranks, made him Assistant Secretary of the Navy. His quote-unquote alter ego was Edwin Mandel House, who started the Communist Party in the United States of America. So Woodrow Wilson had his right-hand man, and FDR certainly had his, which was Harry Hopkins. So very interesting stuff. He also started the Lend-Lease program, which was basically an American program to defeat the Axis by distributing oil and other materials by way of the UK, China, and the Soviet Union. Eventually went to France and all the other allied nations. And they basically did, it included warships and planes and other weaponry. So it was very interesting, the role that Harry Hopkins had within the FDR White House, the long-standing FDR White House.
You write that it was discovered decades later that he was a Soviet spy and operative. What did you find?
Yes, absolutely. There's two KGB defectors, Oleg Kovasinski, and I am not going to even try to pronounce this man's name. It's just a Russian gentleman, because there's no way I'm going to pronounce this one. I'm looking at for the first name. They both identified Harry Hopkins as the mysterious, quote-unquote, Agent 19, who was contacting the Soviet Union with information on the Manhattan Project and the Venona Project. So he was definitely a plant for Stalin. He was definitely up to no good within the government. But back then, things were a little different.
Now, was Hopkins present at Warm Springs on April 12, 1945?
Harry Hopkins was not at Warm Springs.
But he could have given the order to somebody, whether it was Elizabeth Shumatov, the artist, or Nicholas Robbins, the photographer, also a Soviet. I mean, is it possible that Harry Hopkins, acting on orders from Stalin, may have directed someone to slip Roosevelt the poison?
Well, I would say it's not only possible; it's quite probable. He was really baked in the cake of the Roosevelt White House. He was the 8th Secretary of Commerce. He was one of his closest advisors. He was the architect of the New Deal and many relief programs. He was his chief diplomatic advisor during World War II to all of the communist countries. He definitely could have given that order to the other political operatives. I believe that he was working in and around the White House with a secret purpose that FDR was basically being poisoned from within and within the White House for a reason. And I think that was he was later discovered to be a Soviet operative. So I would say it's beyond possible. I would say it's quite probable.
So let's talk about the last few days of Roosevelt's life. He goes to Warm Springs, as he often did, to sort of recover and rest up. This is in Georgia. And this is on the eve of him delivering a speech which is going to open up the United Nations. So let's just talk about what happens in the final days of Roosevelt's life in Warm Springs, and who's present.
I'm sorry, Richard. We have a terrible connection. You broke up. One more time, please.
All right. Let's talk about the last days of Roosevelt's life in Warm Springs. He goes there to rest up on the eve of delivering a speech at the it's an inaugural address of this new institution called the United Nations.
The United Nations is definitely something that Stalin didn't want, but yes, Roosevelt had, he had a lot on his plate. Coming to the end of the war, trying to figure out the post-war world in a way where no one would have the upper hand against something that Stalin didn't want. And he is entertaining at the White House. So here he has, he has all of his favorite people at the White House, the little White House in Warm Springs, Georgia, where he's working on the papers. He's having his portrait painted. He's having his love interest there. He's got a couple of Secret Service guys there. He has his favorite cook, because the cook at the White House was terrible. I mean, how good could the food be if you're being poisoned? So he has his favorite cook making his favorite stew, and he's making himself as comfortable as possible, working through these enormous tasks for a man who is virtually half dead. So the night before, actually the couple nights before, he is eating, believe it or not, Stalin's caviar, drinking Stalin's vodka, which Stalin had given to him, which I just can't believe that, FDR had actually admitted, if you read my book, he actually admitted to believing that he poisoned his wife. Why this man would be eating his caviar is completely beyond me, but he is. So this is what they're doing in the day or two preceding the president's death. He has a barbecue he's going to attend to, doing a couple social things. He's trying to rest as much as possible, and his doctor is checking his blood pressure, almost every 15 minutes. And, he's having problems getting his health in order. So this were the last couple days of FDR's life.
And, of course, the famous portrait that Sumath was working on remained unfinished because, obviously, he died in the midst of that. You have the last photograph taken of Roosevelt the day before he died. And so what's happening around lunch on April the 12th?
He is doing, quote-unquote, doing his laundry. And what that means is opening his mail, and he has papers strewn all over all the tables and all the chairs. And he's trying to go through the paperwork and go through his correspondences. And he has one of his favorite valets there, Arthur Prettyman. It was his personal valet because the president is crippled. So Mr. Prettyman bathes him, clothes him. He has him there helping him with his laundry and answering his correspondences. And he has about 15 or 20 more minutes to work, and he advises the artist and her photographer that they're going to have to start wrapping things up. He had just finished lunch. He had just finished something to drink, and he's dead. Very interesting timing.
What were his last words? Do we know?
I'm sorry?
What were his last words? Do we know?
He clutched the back of his head, according to multiple sources, and said, "I have a terrific headache." So when we talk about poisoning of opposition leaders, I know people tend to roll their eyes because they think that this is, I don't know, completely outlandish or something. But, in my book, I actually go back and I give the whole poisoning of opposition leaders that started in 1331 when it was started, really started to be used as a form of weaponry. Everyone from Rasputin to the Apostle John in the Bible is poisoned. And, of course, political poisonings peaked during the Italian Renaissance in the 14th century. So even today, presidents and high dignitaries have food tasters. And every president since the 1800s has used a similar method. Some of the people, the Roman Emperor Claudius, Napoleon, Mark Antony, Cleopatra, Queen Elizabeth, Lincoln, all of these people had food tasters. Some of the people even used dogs and military prisoners and even monkeys to test their food. So this is a real concern. As a matter of fact, in 1993, Turkey's eighth president was poisoned drinking a glass of lemonade at the Bulgarian embassy. So that's as early as in recent memory is 1993. So, I mean, this is definitely a concern. Even today, modern U.S. presidents have an entire team called the Presidential Food Safety Team to set up a secure zone where the president and the first family can eat within the White House without complication. And of course, when they travel outside of the White House, then they go back to other things to make the dignitary as safe as possible. Traveling, Reagan, both Bushes, President Obama, President Clinton, they've all used food tasters. So this is really, when we talk about poisoning a president, this is not an outlandish thing. I mean, this is a real thing. I mean, this is a real concern. So, and we had people, I had one guy get a hold of me and said, it seems pretty far-fetched. It wasn't that far-fetched. When all of the backdrop that is going on, I think that the American public might be a little naive, but, poor Roosevelt found this out the hard way, and they could not wait to get this guy buried. It was 69 hours from death to travel to grave. That's it. They couldn't get him in the ground fast enough.
Was there an autopsy?
And there was no autopsy. There was no embalming. So, the kicker of the whole thing is that the rumor is swirling around Georgia and around Washington, D.C. for better than a decade after. And it got to the point where Eleanor Roosevelt got so tired of hearing this, she commissioned a private investigator to look into what was going on. So this private investigator gets a hold of, the powers that be in the White House and said he wants the president's medical records. The medical records were stolen from a locked file at Bethesda. 4 people had those keys in the whole country. So if there's nothing to hide, why hide it?
Did you say Bethesda?
Bethesda, yep.
Bethesda Naval Hospital. Wow.
Yep. Magical Bethesda, where all the cool stuff happens.
18 years later, it would figure again in the death of a president. Go figure, Bethesda.
Absolutely.
So, what about rumors that Roosevelt's body had turned black shortly after his death?
I had read that, but there was I tell you what, nothing would surprise me at this point after uncovering what I uncovered.
So, but
I didn't put it in my book because I couldn't verify it.
But would that be consistent with poisoning?
I believe that it would be.
What happened?
Of course, I'm no medical expert,
right.
But I've talked to a forensic pathologist and 3 doctors about this, and they believe that it would be consistent with poisoning. Again, I have no way to verify that, so I didn't put it in my book. But it would not surprise me at all.
What happened to Sumath and her photographer, the other Russian, immediately after Roosevelt died? Were they questioned?
They went on a car excursion with Lucy Mercer across country, trying to get as far away from there as possible. To my knowledge, they were not questioned. I think that they did have attention to them. I think that they were questioned, but they certainly weren't questioned under oath as any sort of suspects or anything like that. I just believe that, they were questioned as to, what happened, what did you see, sort of thing. And I believe that was by the news media, no law enforcement agency questioned them.
Now, we have 2 Russians in close personal contact with the president. They flee, seemingly, immediately after his death, and no one thinks that maybe they should be apprehended or at least detained or questioned. That's rather odd.
That's very odd. And again, this is in Elizabeth Sumath's book. She goes into this at length. The driver of the car is her photographer, Nicholas Cobbins or Kulikinski. I don't exactly know what name he was going by at that time. I believe it was Robbins at that point. He had three names. So Nicholas Robbins is the driver. Lucy Mercer is in the car, and Elizabeth Sumath is in the car, and they're trying as fast as possible to get out of there. And they end up going across country and, hearing the news, on radio and wherever they stopped for gas and so forth. Extremely odd. Should never have happened. They should have been questioned. They should have at least been persons of interest. They are in my book, I'll tell you that. Both of them are persons of interest and suspects in my book, and they well should have been. But back in the time period of the Hawkins, I think we may have been a little naive. You're dealing with, the 1940s. In the 1940s, we were a little bit different as a society back then, and we probably didn't want to believe that such a thing was possible or probable. So they were not questioned or detained.
All right, Stephen, we'll take another time out. Who murdered FDR? The true story they don't want you to know.
Peering into the shadows, where the truth often hides. You're listening to The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett from Zoomer Radio.
Welcome back. Now, this is a short segment, Stephen. We'll chat a little bit. We'll take another time out, and then we'll finish up with a longer segment. But I'm trying to understand why or how it would benefit. I mean, you've alluded to it, but how it would benefit Stalin to have Roosevelt out of the way if Roosevelt was a fan of Stalin. Why would he feel the need to get rid of Roosevelt? Why wouldn't he? He had basically infiltrated the United States to such an extent. It seemed like he had everything going his way with Roosevelt in power.
Well, Roosevelt might have been a fan of Stalin, but nobody really knew Stalin. And he was, again, towards the end of the war, Stalin had his eye on the post-war world the entire time. That was one of the reasons why he was after us to open up the other front in the D-Day invasion. He was after us, to start another front, and he kept pounding and pounding. He said, we need to open up another front so we can get behind Hitler, so we can catch him between. Stalin didn't need that. That was a trick to see how powerful and what kind of a military presence that we could generate. So the entire time that this is going on, this conflict, this war is going on, Stalin has got his eye on China, and he's got his eye on infiltrating and taking over America. Stalin he's striving for world domination. In the same way that he dominated Russia, he had his eye on dominating the world. So he didn't have time for anybody in the United States who was going to stand in his way. So, Roosevelt wanted the four policemen of the world towards the end of the war, so something like this never happened again. He wanted Russia, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and China. None of that was what Stalin wanted. He didn't want to divide the world with FDR. He wanted to rule the world in the same way that he ruled Russia. He knocked off everyone that was in his way politically. If you read, it will make more sense when you read my book, when you start dealing with what Stalin really is and what lengths he went to rule his country. He was one of the first members of the Politburo. One of the first members of the Politburo, and he managed the Bolshevik Revolution with 6 revolutionaries. And he ended up killing all of them and knocking them all off to become, the party's leader. And even Lenin started to realize towards the end of his life what a hideous monster this was. Lenin wrote in his will, quote, "Comrade Stalin is too rude, too dangerous, remove him." After Roosevelt's death, they used to pick on Stalin. They used to call him Comrade Filing Card, Pen Pusher. a gray blur. They didn't think he was any threat to them at all. One by one, they all met their demise, including both of his wives. Anyone who stood in Stalin's way got murdered. So after FDR gets murdered, Stalin sends representatives from Russia to check and make sure that he's really dead. I mean, he was quite a paranoid goofball. So it's spelled out very well in my book as to why he needed FDR out of the way.
You make the point in your book that had Roosevelt lived, and he would have then been president until at least 1948, and who knows, he could have won again, because there were no term limits. You make the point, had Roosevelt lived, there would not have been a Cold War. Explain.
In my opinion, there probably wouldn't have been. You know, all total, there were 87 conflicts related to the Cold War. And, you know, ending in the 1991 Soviet coup d'etat. I don't believe that would have happened because I believe that Stalin had met his mental match with Roosevelt. And I think that he would have kept Stalin in check all the way around the globe. And I think that was the real reason why Truman started the Marshall Plan, and it was to help rebuild the European economies, primarily Poland and Germany and their neighbors, to keep them out of, you know, falling into the Soviet hands. So I don't believe that. In my opinion, no. I think that FDR would have been a step or two ahead of Stalin. I don't believe that would have happened the way it did. And I think that Stalin basically felt the same way. He knew towards the end of the war that FDR needed to go.
What was the most surprising piece of evidence, the most surprising document you uncovered while researching this book?
I think it would have to be a tie. I think it would be the level at which FDR and Eleanor were involved in the Communist Party, the same Communist Party that was funded by Stalin in New York City to overthrow the government. I think that would be a tie right along with President Roosevelt full well knowing that Pearl Harbor had to happen. And, you know, when the documents came out, you know, it just affirmed what I had already known. So that was pretty shocking. Another thing that was shocking to me was Germany. Germany, just like Japan is an oil debtor nation. Germany is a food debtor nation. And one of the things they tried to do to break Hitler was put a blockade around the country and starve them out. So, you know, Hitler had to make a decision. Do I feed my soldiers or do I feed my prisoners? Well, obviously he fed his soldiers. So this is why you see all these emaciated pictures of these poor Jews and other prisoners who are basically skin and bone. You know, not that Hitler would have taken great care of them, but, you know, he needed to divide his rations accordingly. And I think in a roundabout way, we're kind of responsible for that. That was also shocking. You know, the other side of history, don't look at it too hard because the other side of history hurts a little.
All right.
You know, to the victor go the spoils.
Okay, Stephen, stay put. One last go-round. Who murdered FDR? The true story they don't want you to know. Back with more of The Conspiracy Show. My name is Richard Syrett. Another curious aspect of this whole case is Eleanor Roosevelt and the massive FBI files on her. They were on her case for like 40 years, starting in 1924. Why was the FBI, monitoring, surveilling Eleanor Roosevelt as early as 1924? You know, Richard,
I don't have that answer for you. I was shocked myself when I looked at this 3-drawer filing cabinet just loaded with documentation that they had been investigating her for such a time. Possibly they thought she was a double agent. I don't have any idea. But it didn't make sense to me then, and it doesn't make sense to me now. I mean, in the interest of national security, I understand why when you're connecting yourself with Stalin and communists, and Stalin is sponsoring the CPUSA in New York City to overthrow the government, I can understand why that would happen. I don't know why it'd be happening as early as the date that you suggested. That's a new one on me.
Aside from uncovering the fact that she was a communist sympathizer, what else did they find about her? What else did you find in those FBI files?
You know, I glanced over them for her, but my investigation really wasn't into her. I spent maybe half an hour going through them. Basically what I saw was wiretaps of her discussing her political leanings and what she wanted to do with the country, with FDR, with people who, you know, the government was an interest in national security. They were watching. That's basically what I saw. Some of it was ridiculous. Some of it was just rumor and innuendo. Some of it was coincidence. Some of it was hard-crunching investigative work.
You couldn't reprint these letters. You didn't have permission to reprint the photographs of a couple of particular letters in the book, but they had to do with something about she was scolding somebody for ordering food for the president outside of the White House. What was behind
Henrietta
that?
Nesbitt was the White House cook, and I use the word cook loosely. She was a horrific, horrid cook, and the only reason she kept her job is that she was such good friends with Eleanor. FDR would have fired her long ago, and if he did, he probably would have been in much better health because her food was horrific. There's one part of my book where Hemingway is visiting the White House, and he describes the meal as rubber chicken and rainwater soup and all of this horrid food. And there's a time where, again, in the interest of national security, you're only allowed to get food from certain locations. There are approved locations that food is supposed to come from. There was a time when she's battling back and forth with the president. She was making the same dish over and over and over again, and she started to get food outside of her approved places, and she got her hand slapped for it. And I wanted to put that in my book. I wanted to take a picture of that and put it in there because I thought it was very interesting. At the same time, when Roosevelt was getting so sick, she was changing where she was getting the food from. So I was trying to get a picture or a photo of that and put that in my book, but they wouldn't allow that to happen, which I thought was a little bit odd because they didn't really restrict me on doing anything else. You know, the documents, you get a little bit of a thrill, you know, when you're holding top-secret documents in your hand from World War II.
This is interesting because my understanding from your book is that Nesbitt was very close and very sympathetic to Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt and FDR were living totally separate lives at this point because of his infidelity. Now all of a sudden, Mrs. Nesbitt is sourcing food from outside approved sources. Is the suggestion then possibly that Nesbitt is involved in the poisoning of FDR?
It's entirely possible. I'm not going to give my book away, but I'll tell you that she is a suspect when I screen people through motive, means, and opportunity. Her name does come up multiple times. I also find it interesting that when FDR's medical records are stolen from a locked file in Bethesda, 4 people had those keys. And I know I just went on a tangent, but I never finished discussing this, and I think it's worth mentioning. 4 people had those keys in Washington. One of the people who had the keys was Vice Admiral Ross P. McIntyre, our president's doctor, the same person who, in 1946, wrote the book entitled The White House Physician. So I believe they were stolen to cover up what happened to him and also help him write this book. The book is actually, it's on Amazon with a whopping 1-star review. But it's a hardcover book, came out in 1946, which is just a few months after our president died. So I think it's pretty obvious who got those records and what happened to them. History sometimes is, and I know people hate history because it's boring, but if you look at it objectively, it's really not that damn boring. You know, it's pretty interesting stuff.
What happened to Harry Hopkins?
Harry Hopkins eventually moved out of the White House, which was extremely odd. He had, I believe, stomach cancer, and he moved out of the White House. He got remarried, and he died out of the White House. Why he left the White House when he was getting really good medical care, everyone in the White House, because FDR was getting care, the doctor was tending to all of them. Why he would leave the White House while he was getting, you know, top-notch care to run off and die somewhere else is a little bit interesting, but, you know, die he did.
Do you think the CIA and the FBI know that Roosevelt was murdered?
I I really don't know. Nothing would shock me. I'm not going to try and speak for the government, but nothing would shock me.
How is this book being received? Because this obviously flies in the face of a lot of conventional wisdom.
Well, it bothers people because of, people like the normalcy bias. They like to believe and repeat what they've been told for years and years and years and years. When someone like me comes along and reinvestigates things with deathbed confessions and, books that have been published and, new evidence and so forth, they love it and they hate it. They love it because, they recognize the work that went into it and the book sells well. But they also don't like it because I think that people like 2 and 2 to equal the 4 that they're used to. They don't want 2 and 2 to equal 4.5. I think it really screws with their normalcy bias. So the book sells well. People like it. It's disturbing. And oftentimes the truth is disturbing. And George Carlin said it best. They don't want a society of people capable of critical thinking. It really doesn't suit their interests. They meaning, who are in power at the top of our government. They want people to be just smart enough to do some paperwork and keep the machinery going and just dumb enough not to realize how badly they're being screwed over. And when someone like me comes along and reinvestigates things, it's bothersome, but it's fascinating. And I think people are taking it that way.
Who Murdered FDR? This is Volume 2. Just to give us a quick summation of Volume 1, which is Who Murdered Elvis?
Yep, a lot of people don't know that Elvis Presley was murdered. Elvis died mysteriously days before he was supposed to turn state's evidence against the mob. And I befriended one of the people who was not only the investigator at Graceland, but he was the person at Elvis's autopsy. He was charged with the responsibility of checking Elvis's heart out and realized there was no evidence of a heart attack. And Elvis Presley was allergic to codeine. But there was no codeine found in his body because there was no anaphylaxis in his body, but it showed up in one and only one of the 3 toxicology reports. So that's another very interesting book, which we haven't talked about on this one.
People are shocked and absolutely stunned by what they're hearing. For many, this is entirely new information. Most people are like, he was sickly. He was 63. The life expectancy back then wasn't, nearly what it is today. So it makes sense that he would die of natural causes or a cerebral hemorrhage.
It's alarming to hear that, we like truth, justice, and the American way. Unfortunately, if truth was suddenly introduced in American society, the whole system would collapse. I don't think that history has told us the truth on many occasions, this being one of them. Go to whomurderedbooks.com, all lowercase, one word, whomurderedbooks.com, and get yourself a copy, and I think you'll love it.
This is Volume 2. There's going to be 6 eventually. What's coming up next?
Coming up next, the first one is Who Murdered Elvis, and then we have Who Murdered FDR, Volume 2. Volume 3 is Who Murdered Elvis, the 5th year anniversary, because more evidence came out. I'm writing Who Murdered Princess Diana. I just started writing it earlier in this month. So look for that May, June of 2019. And I can tell you it's shaping up to be the best work I've ever done. So I think people are really going to love that book.
Again, it's whomurderedbooks.com, whomurderedbooks.com. Steve, always a delight. Thank you so much for this.
Thank you, Richard. It's always a pleasure.
Steve Ubaney, whomurderedbooks.com. All right, we will be back next week with a brand new program. Thanks to Ian Robertson, Ryan White, Albert Vinzel, all of you for listening. In the meantime, don't be afraid. There's nothing concealed that won't be revealed, and nothing hidden that won't be made known. What you hear in the dark, speak in the light. What I say in a whisper, proclaim from the housetops. Move over, Aphrodite, I'm coming home. Good night.